Welcome to the first video of my video series on my PhD research on South Shore. My name is Tillman, and this video is talking about how newspapers talk and frame South Shore as a community. And the reason why I did this analysis as a first step in my PhD was to understand how outsiders to the community learn about the community through newspapers. And newspapers continue to be very important sources for people to get information. And so how newspapers talk about a community is very important in suggesting certain ideas about South Shore as a community. So what I did in my PhD was to analyze 3 newspapers and how they talk about South Shore. These are the Chicago Tribune, the Chicago Sun-Times, and the Chicago Defender. And the reason why I focus on these 3 newspapers is that the first 2, the Tribune and the Sun-Times, are very big newspapers in Chicago and abroad, even elsewhere in the United States. So many people read them. So when they talk about South Shore, they reach a larger audience in comparison to other newspapers. And the Chicago Defender is a newspaper that is very much focusing on the south and west side of Chicago. It is a black newspaper, so it's a completely different approach to reporting on the south and west side. And I wanted to understand and see perhaps similarities and differences in how the 3 papers talk about South Shore. So what I did was that I went through the online archives of the 3 newspapers, and I looked for all articles that included the name South Shore between 2013 and 2018. And the reason why I focused on this time frame was that I wanted to have a long enough time frame to see whether or not the ways in which the newspapers talk about South Shore might change over time or might stay the same. So I filtered the online archives and excluded those articles that only talked about the South Shore Cultural Center, because these articles did not give enough information about the community as such. So I ended up with approximately 1,500 articles, which I then analyzed in how they portray South Shore as a community. And in this table, you can see which topics were particularly emphasized by the 3 newspapers. So in this table, I included those topics that were at least covered 10 times in one of the 3 newspapers. So you see that the grocery store on 71st Street was a topic frequently talked about in the Tribune and the Sun-Times. The same goes for the Obama Presidential Center and the Tiger Woods golf course. And in the case of the Chicago Sun-Times, fires, car and other accidents, as well as missing person reports, were also frequently covered. But as you also can see, the most important and dominant topic was violence and crime in the Tribune and the Sun-Times, whereas the Chicago Defender only had 68 articles as in total and did not focus on violence and crime that much in comparison, but I will talk about the Defender at the end of the video. So this is already a very interesting and important finding to see which topics are more foregrounded, which topics are more important to the newspapers when they talk about South Shore. And so for me, it was now the question, okay, this is interesting. I know that the distributions between topics, but I don't know enough about the language that the newspapers used in describing violence and crime in the community. So what I did was I looked into the reportings about violence and crime and the articles that talked about that and analyzed what language did the Tribune and the Chicago Sun-Times use. And what I identified was that, first of all, frequently the 2 papers use certain categorizations and naming practices in labeling South Shore in a certain way. And these are all associated with violence and crime, and I give here some of the labels that I have identified. So, for example, South Shore was frequently portrayed as a violence-plagued community, which is ill and sometimes even infested by gangs. And South Shore was also occasionally referred to as a war zone, which is under siege by gangs. So we see here references to war zone and how we report about war and warfare. So this was the first language focus that I identified, that the community was often portrayed through certain categorization and naming practices. But beyond that, I also identified that the Tribune and the Sun-Times frequently used what we call hyperbolic language, so exaggerated terms, exaggerated language to talk about South Shore. So here are some examples, for example, that gunfire is as commonplace as honking car horns, the toxic ubiquity of drugs and gangs, concentrated slaughter. These are extreme ways to portray violence and crime. And this hyperbolic language was less frequent than the naming practices, but still happened in both papers and when they talked about South Shore and the violence and crime in it. But the most common way of talking about violence and crime in South Shore was actually not so much extreme language or naming practices, but rather these breaking news articles about an incident of violence and crime that happened. So take this following example. An 18-year-old man was shot Thursday afternoon in the South Shore neighborhood. This was an article, that's it, no further information available, that frequently was used by both papers to report on a crime that happened in South Shore. And what I argue in my PhD is that this form of reporting is very, very rudimentary in the way that it does not provide enough information about the circumstances of the crime. So we don't learn about who did the crime and why it happened. We only learn that someone was shot in a certain area in South Shore, but beyond these information, we don't learn anything else. And more often than not, the two papers reported on the same incidents a couple of times over the course of a week, thereby, what I argue, producing this never-ending flow of information about violence and crime. It was therefore almost impossible to escape reportings on violence and crime because they were frequently and repetitively talked about in newspaper articles by the Tribune and the Chicago Sun-Times. So what I argue here is that this is actually the most important way of talking about violence and crime, but we don't learn enough about the circumstances. We don't learn enough why it happened. So for an outsider, I argue, it is very difficult to understand why violence happens. The only thing that he or she learns about South Shore is that violence is in the community. But I did not want to just describe how violence and crime is reported on by the two newspapers, but I also analyzed the social consequences of such reporting. And what I argue in my PhD is that two things happen when we report on violence and crime in this way. The first one is that the community is territorially stigmatized. What I mean by is that basically the community is only known to outsiders through violence and crime. Nothing else is really reported on. So there's this constant flow of information about violence and crime in South Shore, and someone who is not familiar with the community does not learn enough about other things that also happen in South Shore. So it is stigmatized as a violent space, and where violence and crime are so frequent and common that it is barely impossible to walk the community. And the second argument that I make is that this discourse is also racist, because it is suggesting that we can essentially equate a black community with the occurrence of violence and crime. Although both papers, the Tribune and Sun-Times, never explicitly stated that it is because South Shore is black, violence and crime occurs, but nevertheless the fact that we constantly learn about crime and violence in South Shore is already suggesting that there is some form of equation between the black community and violence and crime. And this is racist because it is essentially stereotyping an entire community, which is unfair and does not reflect everyday life. So after I analyzed the Chicago Tribune and Chicago Sun-Times and how they talk about South Shore, I wanted to contrast that with how the Chicago Defender does that. And even though we very occasionally, the Chicago Tribune and Chicago Sun-Times talks about other things than violence and crime, we do nevertheless learn mostly about South Shore through the lens of violence and crime. And the Chicago Defender doesn't do that. The Chicago Defender is completely the opposite. So when it talks about South Shore explicitly, it focuses on things such as cultural events, community gardens, social activities, those kind of things. And when they talk about violence, it is about police violence, it is about youth programming and how violence can be overcome. So this is a completely different focus, and it particularly contextualizes the violence into the socio-economic and structural circumstances that exist in South Shore. So it is not just stereotyping and labeling the community, but it is actually providing enough in-depth information about the circumstances of violence and crime so that the reader understands what happens in South Shore and perhaps why violence does take place occasionally in the community. So the next question that I asked myself is, so why does the Chicago Defender focuses on different topics, and why does it report differently on South Shore? And my answer to that question was that it is the history of the Chicago Defender as a black newspaper in Chicago that has very much shaped black life and black culture across the South Side and the West Side as well. So it is aware of the racism that can be produced through stigmatizing newspaper reporting, so it doesn't want to reproduce that. So this is for me the reason why the Chicago Defender is focusing on other topics in different ways in their reporting. But I would be very interested to hear your opinions on that as well. Perhaps I have missed some important historical circumstances that can explain why the Defender is talking differently about South Shore. I do want to finish my videos by also asking some questions to you. It is important to me that you also just let me know what you think about my analysis. It is important to emphasize that this is my interpretation of the findings and facts. So it might be that someone else who does the same analysis of newspapers comes to a different conclusion. So I would be interested to hear and learn about your perspectives and how you perceive newspaper reporting on South Shore, and whether or not you agree with me in how I analyze newspapers. Perhaps even did I miss something that you think is important in understanding newspaper reporting on South Shore. So please leave a comment below the video and let me know what you think about how newspapers talk about South Shore.